Good evening, everyone, at least for those of us who are on the other side of the world, and good morning for those of you in the West Coast. My name is Melina Sánchez, and I will be the moderator for this session. So a bit about me, my background is in impact investing and social entrepreneurship from the various spectrums of capital and profit impact returns. So I have worked for impact VCs in Israel and the US. I have worked for a venture philanthropy and most recently for the World Economic Forum in the COVID Alliance for Social Entrepreneurs, which is a multi-stakeholder network that mobilizes support for social entrepreneurs during these difficult times of COVID-19. And this session is on social innovation and entrepreneurship, which I believe should be a topic in every accelerator, incubator, and any other type of entrepreneurship program. And why do I think that's the case? One just have to look at the last decade and see the evolvement of the industry. So there are three factors that I think have marked social innovation over the last decade. The first one is the demand push. There are more consumers that demanding socially conscious and sustainable products. Two, there is an emerging business case for it as well. More and more data is emerging that proves that sustainable companies are as profitable, if not more, than traditional companies. And one just have to look at companies like Tesla, Lemonade, or Impossible Foods. And then there is also a supply factor, and that is that more and more capital across asset classes is at the very least looking at ESG factors, so environmental, social, and governance factors. And some are even looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, that's the last decade. Now we are at an inflection point, and that inflection point obviously is COVID-19. And COVID-19 has proven that a lot of the incumbent solutions don't work anymore. And that's why now is the right time to venture into social innovation. But without telling you all what our panelists are gonna share with us today, I'm gonna pass off the baton to our panelists for very short 2-minute introductions, after which we'll kick off this panel. So Justin, you go first.
Thank you for that, Melina. My name is Justin Beck. I'm the founder and CEO of Contakt World. We're a public health technology and ad agency designed to help the world this pandemic and also prepare for other crises of humanity.
I hope you're doing well. I'm a primary care doctor in DC, and I guess you could say a serial social entrepreneur. So I've started a couple companies in healthcare that have gone public. I set up a global nonprofit and then worked at the World Bank in a digital health role as well. So great to be part of the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Great to see everyone. My name is Nital Park. I'm the founder and CEO of Innovate Social. And I really come to the space of social enterprise through law, looking at the legal structures. And that has really expanded to making social entrepreneurship more accessible, actionable, and transformative through events that we do called Impactathons, through book and media like hosting a podcast. So I think it's all about building an ecosystem for longevity and for success ahead. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zahin Hussain. I'm currently serving as a consultant with the UNDP and Citi Foundation's program called Youth Collab. I support entrepreneurs across Asia's emerging markets with a focus on leaving no one behind as we accelerate entrepreneurial initiatives to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. Thank you for those sweet and short intros. Now, when I was in college not that long ago, people were not really talking about social entrepreneurship. I feel that it's only in the last few years that the social innovation entrepreneurship sector has really picked up steam. And still there is a lot of misunderstanding about what social innovation really is. Actually, one of my favorite misunderstandings, and I say favorite, but I really mean annoying, is when people tell me that impact startups cannot be as profitable as normal startups. So my first question is for Neetal and Zahin. How is social innovation or entrepreneurship different from traditional innovation?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and Melina, you come from such a rich background in all of this, so I really appreciate that. If this is what you're hearing in your circles, and then it's really a true question. And I think one of the big shifts or unique parts of social enterprise is the acknowledgement or addressing of impact through impact measurement, through kind of realizing that companies don't only make profit, but they are also they should be responsible for stakeholders, not just shareholders. And I think that's a shift in mindset, because especially in corporate law and in the history of corporations, there's always a focus on the shareholder wealth. Maximizing shareholder wealth is a buzzword or key phrases. But I think with social enterprise, we're expanding that idea and really focusing on the stakeholders, including the communities that are impacted, including the environment. And that really is a huge shift.
If I can add a little bit to what Neetal has shared, definitely agreed that we're seeing the move from simply maximizing wealth for shareholders to having a more ecosystem approach to integrate the needs as well as the consequences for stakeholders. But I think where I would, distinguish social enterprises from more traditional startups or businesses would be on sort of the fact that we're considering external value. So when we're designing a startup and a company, it's more, it's very internally focused. It's about the internal processes, the staff, the shareholders, and it's very inward looking. And we're talking about value creation. It's moving from inside out. But I think when we're talking about social entrepreneurship, it's addressing the tragedy of the commons. And it's understanding that as businesses, it's not only about how we create value for the company and again, the shareholders, but how are we factoring for the consequences of business conduct in the communities that we operate in, and more so on the planet. So I think it's about embedding external value into the existence of the business.
Thank you. And Neetal, you mentioned impact measurement, and Zahin, we were talking yesterday actually in our conversation about how through your work you have to advise startups on how to track not only operational and financial data, but also impact data. Can you give us some highlights about what that means and what it takes to measure across impact and operational?
Yeah, so in my work, I tend to work primarily with early stage startups. And what we see when they're in the early stages, it's hard enough to build a business. It's another, it seems like another mile to run when they also have to incorporate impact metrics. So we in our work, when we try to identify companies that have sort of achieved a product market fit. They have sustainable cash flow. After that, we can talk about impact. And I think when it comes to sort of structuring the impact metrics, there are a lot of frameworks in the market right now. Of course, social return on investment being one of the more popular ones. We're seeing a lot of benchmarking with the Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators that we're using to measure progress towards the SDGs. Recently, I started looking at GIN has a framework called IRIS. I personally have not used that, but I think that is starting to gain momentum. And finally, we're seeing the impact measurement project. So these are just a few examples that I think have sort of formed the industry standards globally. But I think, I think impact measurement is one of those topics that I think everyone gets really heated about, because there is no one size fits all. And we're seeing how these broader frameworks are being customized to meet the needs of specific markets, as well as industries and the area of impact that they're really trying to measure. So if we're trying to measure for poverty alleviation versus sort of the responsible consumption, we do need to have different maxims that we're working with and that requires different processes. But I think those ones, IRIS, social impact, the impact measurement project, the SDGs, I think that's a great place for emerging entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs to start when they're thinking about impact measurement.
Yeah, if I could just add one more suggestion, there's a great book called Lean Impact by Anmei Chang, where she took the lean startup principles and applied them to the social sector. She was like head of innovation at USAID and saw that this measurement, particularly for early stage social entrepreneurs, was really challenging. So just highly recommend that.
Thank you. And to add one more to your list, Zahin, actually, the impact-weighted accounts from Harvard Business School is also a new framework that is being developed in the industry. So it's not about a lack of frameworks, that's for sure. So great, so we've covered the basics about what social innovation is. So let's take the next step, which is to identify a social challenge to create the venture around. So Neetal, if you were an entrepreneur in the LISA cohort, how would you go about identifying a social challenge that equates to a business need?
Yeah, one of the things that we do at Impactathon that we started doing actually, because sometimes there can be a cursory look at social impact issues that are actually much deeper. So I really recommend doing problem mapping in some form or another, like taking what you think to be an issue in society that you've seen or observed and really drilling down, trying to understand what you see. Is that a root problem or is that a symptom? And start understanding the ecosystem that and also solutions can be introduced that are there internal or solutions that can be amplified. So I think really any issue and start moving. And one of the simple ways we can learn from our 5-year-olds, if we know any, is just asking why and asking it maybe 4 or 5 times. And that is really an element of design thinking. So I would say if you feel like you don't have an issue, if you're in the LISA cohort and you can't identify, I don't think it may be a depth issue. You just need to go a little deeper because there are so many issues that are interconnected. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been mentioned on this talk, are a great example of the interconnectedness of some of these various issues that we have that we're facing and trying to solve.
Thank you, Neetal. And I think that you got lost for the first part of your intervention, at least on my side. I don't know if everyone else could hear, but I was interested in digging a little bit deeper in how you advise hackathons to develop these social challenges or identify them in a short period of time. Because as you said, it can take a long time to find the root cause, right? The why, and then go to the next why and to the next why. But at some point, social entrepreneurs have to make trade-offs. So how do you advise hackathons to do that?
Yeah, I think if you are just looking in a short period of time to try to find an issue quickly to form a team around, I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a great place to start, because not only do you have the 17 goals, but you have so many criteria, and they have a lot of information that will start pointing you in the direction of a really solvable but difficult problem, along with statistics that can help guide you as to where your energy can be focused. So I would say, yes, the Sustainable Development Goals are a great place to start if you are looking to kind of quickly identify an issue, especially with a cohort or team. Great.
And since we have entrepreneurs among our panelists, I'll turn to Dr. Shantanu from Accolade. So Accolade's vision is that every person shall live their healthiest life. What were the founders thinking back in 2007, sorry, not 20, when they were trying to identify the challenge, and how did they translate that challenge into a viable business model?
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. So, I think the key insight, a lot of great businesses are built, from from sort of an insight that no one else has, right? And I think that in this case, what these folks realize is that, particularly in US healthcare, right, you got doctors, you have hospitals, you have insurance companies, but the sort of the key challenge that they really honed in on was complexity. Like, all of us have probably felt this during the pandemic, when you just want to ask a simple question like, where do I get a test? How do I get the vaccine? It's really that complexity that's paralyzing and leads people to make bad decisions. Like, people show up in the ER not because they want to waste the health system's resources and have a big surprise bill. They show up there because they're not really sure where else to go. And so that really simple insight led them to come up with a very simple model to say, well, what if we could give everybody basically like a travel agent, give everyone what we call a health assistant, somebody to call when you have those questions to figure out what's the next step to take. So that was sort of the second step. And then the third is, okay, well, what's the business model? And so what they realized was that, for anyone that's US based, if you have an insurance card in your wallet, on the back of it will be a phone number that you can call. And most insurance companies, when you call that number, you get a robot or multiple IVR screens. They realize that that's actually the secret front door to healthcare in the US. Because when people call that number, it's because they're looking to access the health system and they have a question. And it was really those three things combined that led to the genesis of Accolade. They said, let's have that phone number come to Accolade. Let's have it be answered right away with the human being. That human being is going to be your dedicated health assistant or travel agent and will help you figure out the next step in your care. And so that from that very simple thing, which by the way is also very testable, like you don't have to do a huge build necessarily to do that. That was the genesis of Accolade. And now we're up to 2 million Americans, growing 25% a year, became a public company this past summer. But really it was that really simple sort of thought process and sort of experimentation that led to the idea.
Thank you. From experimentation to market size, I will want to do a final spin to this identification of the social challenge part and call on Zahin, because you told me yesterday that a Youth Collab scouts for innovations that leave no one behind. And that reminds me actually of the many impact funds in emerging markets that serve the bottom of the pyramid, which is a market size of 4 billion people. So from your experience at Youth Collab, how do you identify the right social and business opportunities based on that vision?
Yeah, I think that I think what's interesting is just comparing between the traditional way of, startup, the discourse that exists, and how entrepreneurs, find a unique insight and they create a model around delivering a solution. I think the way that social entrepreneurs go about doing that is actually quite similar. So when we're working, so impact fund or funds for early stage entrepreneurs would really look at two things, right? They would look at the team. Do these people have the right skills, experiences, networks, and passion to solve the problem that they have identified in the market? And the second element is the problem big enough? Is there a large addressable market that creates that we could see that the company has the potential to scale and scale at speed? So I think if we take that logic and look at the social innovation and social entrepreneurship space, it's a similar logic when we're thinking about the problems that we want to solve in the social and environmental domains. Similar to what Neetal has described so far, is you want to keep asking why, and get to the root cause of this problem. And from the insight that you have gained by going deeper into that problem, you want to come up with a model, a simple solution that can hopefully cut through the complexity and the noise and be able to deliver something to those who need that solution the most. And the validation around that is, of course, as you said, there is a market. When we're talking about the bottom of the pyramid, it's more the purchasing power tends to be the main challenge for entrepreneurs to address if they're looking at the bottom of the pyramid as a consumer group. But I think there are a lot of really great sort of models now that pioneering social entrepreneurs have developed, where they are able to meet the needs of the bottom of the pyramid, but having the revenue source the revenue source is coming from another consumer group, right? So we have that. You're essentially, again, that's the stakeholders. So the bottom of the pyramid is they're the stakeholders, but your consumers are a different group. But all in all, what I would highlight when it comes to the market size is it's about taking the bottom-up approach. I think is really important in social entrepreneurship, is starting with what is the problem that is experienced by the people, and building up from there, and then working top down from the broader frameworks that we have, like the SDGs, where a lot of data is now available on the breadth and depth of that ecosystem, and trying to find, like, essentially build a narrative on how the bottom and top, where they meet, right? So I think that is where social entrepreneurs have the responsibility to develop that narrative.
Thank you for that great distinction between clients and stakeholders or beneficiaries. And that's actually going to be part of the second question. But before we go there, just a reminder for everyone that you can include your questions in the chat. We'll select some at the end of this panel. Great, so we have talked about our problem definition and how it translates into viable business models. Now it's time for product design. And one of the most common mistakes that I see from social entrepreneurs is that they build products for a target audience, so beneficiaries, who are not necessarily part of the development or the design of that product. But I know that that's not the case of Contakt World. So Justin, I'm sure the audience wants to know how Contakt World has included beneficiaries in the development of the product, in the design of the product. So enlighten us with us.
Well, that's really simple. We hired Deepti. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I recognized early on that, there were a lot of pandemic technologies emerging at the onset of this. And the problem that, it was evident, nobody was really building anything for people to use. And lo and behold, I talked to even multinational corporations that thought they were going to solve pandemic response, like, IBM had a big team dedicated to it. And I'm sitting there in a conversation and they're explaining how nobody's using anything that they're trying to deploy. So I recognized early on that human-centered design and building things that people actually wanted to use would not only help solve the pandemic and the situation that we're in, but it would actually create a sustainable model to combat future crises of humanity. So to ensure that our systems would be relevant, we made a dedication to speaking with the users of the system. And that meant actually, surveying them very directly, asking them as many questions as possible, and also actually engaging them in the design process so that we know that and it hasn't necessarily been the fastest answer, and it's not been, the most efficient in terms of deploying a product, but we do believe that by engaging with our actual users, it's going to give us a sustainable business rather than a flash in the pan.
That's great. And for those in the audience who might be a little bit new to the impact world or impact vocabulary, you're not alone. Beneficiaries, impact startups, social enterprises. There is a lot of vocabulary out there, and sometimes it's difficult to understand what is what. So that being said, social entrepreneurship can take a lot of shapes and forms. An impact startup is not the same as a social enterprise, which is obviously not the same as a nonprofit that has products in an earned revenue type of model. So the next question is for Neetal. What would you advise, or how would you advise the audience and the entrepreneurs out there to evaluate the different options within the social innovation landscape, both from a financial but also legal perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think some of these things are actually really interconnected. So that's even what I learned when I first started in the space. Is I mentioned I came in from a legal lens, but as I started attending more talks and kind of talking to more people, I realized the legal, the funding, the measurement, so many of those things are connected. So when it comes to, if you're right at the start, I would, really think about, like, if you think about a legal structure, I think of it as a glove that should fit your business model. Like, they're not separate. So if you think that your funding can come from more nonprofit or foundation sources, then that might influence the kind of legal structure that you pursue. It may be more of a nonprofit structure, so you can apply for grants and apply for funding that way. If you think your funders are going, or if you're working in technology and you think your funders are more from the impact investment or venture capital, then you may look more towards a corporate structure. And then there's a few other things that I would just want to highlight, is that sometimes if you don't know at that early stage, you're just a few people and you haven't decided that far, there are also some really interesting options, such as one is called fiscal sponsorship, where you can borrow the 501c3 status of a nonprofit or foundation to raise funds, and you may have to pay them a certain percentage. But before you decide to jump in and decide that your entity will be a nonprofit, you can, try out what that feels like, what that fundraising feels like, what that mode feels like before you commit. So yeah, so there's definitely some different options. And, and a lot of people feel like, when they start hearing about legal structures, they feel like they need to rush in and decide. But in reality, you can also do some lean structures at the beginning, like an LLC, that will give you some time to know, what is your entity, and just like we mentioned, lean methodology. I think that same playfulness or ability to shift and change should apply to your business model, because sometimes you won't know the business model until you try a few out. And because sometimes you are creating impact for a beneficiary, but the beneficiary may not be the buyer or the client, you might need to try different things to kind of assess, like, and see where the growth will come from and where the revenue streams will come from.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback, I think Neetal completely agree. And I think the other dimension I'd add is there's optionality. Like, you can change. So, a couple companies ago, I started it as a nonprofit, and then I switched it to a for-profit. Then I had one that was an LLC. I switched it to a B Corp, and then I built a tandem nonprofit. And so those things happen. And I think they're more understood, they're more accepted. And I always think about what's going to help you learn fastest as you're starting, and really start serving people and figure out what what is, and you certainly have optionality to change as well.
And I would like actually to open this question to the rest of the panelists, because I'm sure that you also have insights. I'm a little bit stuck on the point about, if I am an entrepreneur and I'm thinking about my social challenge and decide what type of venture I want to build on the returns profile, right? If I want to build more of a nonprofit model or a for-profit model or anything in between. So when I'm in such an early stage, do I have to even worry about that? How should I position myself? How should I think about the type of business model that is attached to the type of return profile that I might want to pursue?
Sure. I think just building on the other panelists' comments, when you consider structure, before that even, you should look at two themes that really translate a social challenge to a business need. And I think that those two themes are government or NGO investment. So on one hand, you have a social challenge or a need, and then on the other hand, you have a good indicator that it will become a business by looking at investments that are either flagged for future investment or that are happening around a social challenge. And then another thing that really drives investment is changes in law or changes in regulation. So, everything that we're seeing around, green energy was driven by changes in regulations and also, people being awakened to the problems of climate change. But the changes in law and regulation are actually what built Tesla to what we see it as today. If you look at the way that they've made money, it's actually less about making cars and it's more about capitalizing on the stimulus provided from the government. So before you start to think about the legal structure of your actual entity, think about how to translate the things that matter to you into a business. And you can always get a good indication of it turning into a business by looking at stimulus investments, rebates, things that are happening from governments, and then also the changes in laws or regulation that drive that.
Yeah, and if I think I can provide a more of an emerging markets perspective here. So of course, when we're working with companies in the US, it is a more comprehensive framework that companies are working in, and you have various legal options as well as financing schemes. All of this is not necessarily available in an emerging market. And so what we've seen with the companies and the entrepreneurs that we're working with is they're really learning and adapting. And I think that would be, I think that's a lesson that everyone everywhere can sort of understand, that when you are building a high growth company and addressing a problem that you're saying, that others have not been able to figure out so far, there is a learning curve, and there's absolutely no way that you can know the appropriate structure and spectrum of financing and who your partners are going to be at the onset. It's about adapting on the fly. But and to give you a few examples of some of the work that our companies have done, is we're seeing a lot of our startups in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, registering their companies in Singapore, say, right? And that opens them up to a very different financing and legal landscape than their home jurisdictions. And it's interesting to see also how those markets are actually responding based on the experiences of the startups, right? So when you have a critical mass of social enterprises in Bangladesh registering in Singapore, that then opens the conversation for what can we do better here in Bangladesh to create a more friendly regulatory environment for our social startups to thrive and get the same benefits that they might have when they're going to Singapore. So it's really interesting to see how the experiences are very much interconnected, and we're learning from each other. Not just the founders, but really the whole ecosystem is learning from the experience.
Fantastic. Oh, Justin, do you have something to add? Please go ahead.
I was just gonna take it down and a level, and that makes complete sense from an emerging markets perspective. I was just going to give an example of a trend, the macroeconomic trend, and how that's driving at least our business, what I think will be sustainable. So I learned in the early, when we founded this company, Contakt World, that the public health system suffers from a lack of prior investment and that it's broadly not equitable. And the trend here, especially with government stimulus, suggests that there's going to be a, scaled investment in public health infrastructure and a lot of potential impact to improve equity because we have an inequitable health system and the government is already going to pour billions of dollars into public health. So here we're taking what was a thesis in the beginning that our health system is underbuilt for a pandemic, and then we're matching our business model to significant government stimulus so that not only can we have a social impact, but we can actually build a business around that.
Fantastic. Reminder to the audience, please include your questions in the chat. There have not been that many yet, and I'm sure that people are curious about all the topics we're discussing today. So the last spin to this conversation is obviously, as the title of the session also suggests, COVID-19. And on the one hand, the pandemic has accelerated pre-existing themes like online education and remote work. But on the other hand, it has also surfaced new challenges, which can be turned into opportunities. And healthcare obviously is top of mind. So Justin, you started Contakt World literally as a response to the pandemic to improve healthcare communication, which also goes beyond the pandemic. And Dr. Shantanu, you are publishing a book that I will put the link to in the chat in just a minute about healthcare after the pandemic. So what changes do you both see, both in the healthcare, but also in the social sector after COVID-19? And what do you advise the entrepreneurs in the audience to do to take advantage of those changes while designing, thinking, and building their ventures?
For the first question, I think that we're going to see changes in accessibility of healthcare. What the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, it's been the great revealer of inequities in our healthcare system, and then taking an honest look at our healthcare system, at least in the United States, we spend more money than anywhere, but we also have the lowest quality of care, and that means that we're going to see innovation in the way that our especially marginalized populations can access healthcare. And what we're innovating is the way that public health agencies can serve their communities, because they've historically been a dearth of resources. And we're committed to helping the way that public health agencies can actually do their work. Because historically, I mean, they've literally been working off of Excel spreadsheets trying to perform things like contact tracing. When it comes to innovating in a post-COVID world broadly, for any entrepreneur, I think that one of the things that I've learned from the pandemic that's really a positive thing is that our concept of the workday is completely changed, and our concept of collaboration is different. And I actually think that it's going to be a sustainable improvement in our economy, because just as we're in this panel today, nobody drove to go to a location together to have this panel, and we're now actually becoming probably more productive in some circumstances. So as innovators and as entrepreneurs, it's incumbent on us to kind of change the way that we envision a workday. And I think that that's going to lead to even more innovation. And by making sure that we are collaborating in new ways and empowering new employees that don't have to come necessarily to the same office every day, that we'll actually find that adapting to people's lifestyles, maybe we're going to have more innovation and we're going to be more productive as a society. But it's also very, there's a slippery slope. We have to make sure that that doesn't create more inequities, because, even the COVID-19 pandemic has actually left a lot of children behind in the United States that don't have access to the same technology that we're using right now. So on one hand, there's opportunity, but also we have to be really cognizant of how that opportunity can create more disparities. So it's very difficult, but we're looking to innovate in these arenas.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this question, and I think innovation and entrepreneurship often happens when sort of the fault lines shift, and I think that's what we've seen. The way I sort of sometimes say it seems a little extreme, but I think society has changed more in the last 12 months than it has in its sort of modern history, and I think that's profound in terms of the shifts, right? So in healthcare, in my space, right, like the idea that as a doctor who sees patients every Friday in the safety net, I never did a telehealth visit before the pandemic. And as a patient, I've never had it. And I've done those now multiple times. And the same analogy is true in schools, right? Like my kids who are 7 and 5, have done school for the first time online. And that's not the only shift. We talk a lot about that one, but even things like home-based care has dramatically accelerated during this time. Like we're actually hospitalizing some patients at home. We're connecting with people in new ways, right? So now all my patients, I have a separate phone for my clinic, and my patients text me. And similarly, my kids have email. My 7-year-old has email. And so I think the way that I've made sense of this change is that I really think the future of society has accelerated towards one that is distributed, that is digitally enabled and decentralized. So by distributed, I mean that services are going to happen much closer to the people who need those services, so at home and in the community, right? By digitally enabled, what I mean is that you can use data and technology to strengthen human relationships, right? So again, my patients that text me doesn't substitute for seeing me, or my daughter who emails with her teacher doesn't substitute for having care in a classroom, or teaching in a classroom, but it augments it. And then finally, decentralize. What we're seeing is that we really need to allow clinics and schools to make the decisions for themselves, right? So for example, if you're a clinic in Texas where people are still comfortable coming to clinic, that might be fine. If you're in Seattle where people are taking social distancing really seriously, you might need to find ways of delivering care into the home. If you're a school like my daughter's where there's a lot of space and they can actually safely reopen, maybe they can reopen. And if you're a school that's in a crowded inner city, you can't. And so if you think about those fault lines that have shifted, distributed, digitally enabled, decentralized, what that's going to do is create massive opportunities for social entrepreneurs, right? So for example, if now care is being delivered to the home, like you do virtual care, but now you got to get a test to somebody, it creates this new last mile challenge, right? Like getting care in a clinic and a hospital means you don't have to solve the last mile. People just show up and they get their tests and everything in the same place. Once it's at home, that's different. Once care gets digitally enabled or schools get digitally enabled, privacy and security become more important issues, or having different data silos talk to each other become more important. So I think the point is, I think to an audience like yours is the world's changed. Not everyone's realized it, and the people that realize that sooner are going to find that there's tremendous opportunities. And look, the world wasn't working well before. Like, trust me, my clinic was not great before. COVID didn't break the healthcare system. COVID showed that the healthcare system was broken. And so I'm really looking at this as a catalytic opportunity to say, let's build it the right way now. And that's true for healthcare. That's true for schools. That's true for, U.S. education wasn't great. I'm sorry, before the pandemic either. This is our chance to do it. And I think the folks on this call, not the old people like me, are going to be the ones that are going to figure out those spaces and help solve for them.
Yeah, I just building on that. I mean, just to emphasize the innovation that could change, public health. I mean, coming into this with Contakt World, it drove me crazy to think that in Houston, Texas, they are receiving fax machine test results for COVID-19, and literally piles of faxes going on their floor, and then they're somehow supposed to perform contact tracing for a disease that moves asymptomatically in days before they can even enter the data on their Excel spreadsheet. So as innovators, I mean, there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit, to Shantanu's point, that we can do to improve. And, healthcare being an industry, the largest industry there is, there are so many data silos and so many things to innovate. And that's just an example of what most people would think is such a common and easy fix. That would literally save people's lives. You simply create optical character recognition for fax machines of test results, and suddenly you're going to end up disrupting huge transmission chains of a virus. So, and there's in the public health system, there's so many different little things that we just haven't done previously that represent opportunity for large industry.
And Neetal, I think that you were unmiking yourself before, but if not, never mind.
Yeah, just the one thing I wanted to add is that in some ways, this pandemic has also been this great equalizer, that whether like there's no one that's an expert at this. No one is an expert at surviving or making it through a pandemic. So if I talk to my 4-year-old nephew, his experience is as valid as my experience. And I think if we really listen to that, and as we kind of have a listening tour after this to understand what people's experiences were, I think there are some truths that we through a common experience that the globe went through. So I think one of the things that we'll also see is, I live in Silicon Valley area where there's always a race to the latest, greatest tech. But, tech doesn't work when people cannot use the tech or get online. So all of the greatest online learning tools are not relevant if people are not able to get online. So I think we'll see, I think the social entrepreneurs of the world will figure out the low tech or right tech kind of way to serve education for communities that maybe have been overlooked or not included in this whole online or learning trend. And so I think there's a lot of listening that can happen. And I think that we're all equal in this. So I think maybe that's, as some of the other panelists were saying, if we're looking at a system that wasn't working, well, now we all have something that we're all in the same space of to rebuild better.
Those are great points. We really, that is a thing that we've really learned from this too, is that while people are making fancy technology, we can't forget that there's a whole, a lot of people that are going to miss out if we don't meet people where they are, which is a common public health edict. You have to meet people where they are, and it's not always about technology.
Move on now to the questions from the audience, because now they keep coming and they are actually very exciting. So the first one that I picked out here for you is, it's not the same to solve a problem by its root causes as designing products that people love. Example, many people love sugar, fat, or not exercising. So what is your approach to finding a balance between solving real problems and developing products that people love?
That is an awesome question. I always look at my colleagues who start purely sort of for-profit things, and they say, look, all you got to do is build something that people love, which is, by the way, extremely hard for those of you that have tried. But for us, we have to build something that people love and have that thing create social impact, both of which are extremely hard things, right? Like when I was at the World Bank, we built lots of things that were impactful, nobody used them. And then there's, things that people use that don't give impact. And it is extremely challenging. And I think it's probably a pretty trite statement, but I think that's where I think user-centered design meets sort of impact thinking is really needed. It's really this sort of Venn diagram between the two. And there's real trade-offs. So I think everyone wants to have everything, but the reality is you do have to choose, and particularly you might have to sort of phase in the impact. I think my bias, I think I've learned the hard way many times, is to bias towards something people love and use. And as it scales, you can expand the uses for that thing, rather than trying to build the perfect thing that solves the social root cause, but that nobody uses or nobody cares about. I mean, everyone asks about competition. Your competition is actually getting people to care. Your competition is actually the status quo. It's not some other app or some other tech company or something. It's really the default, the status quo. And so I guess I have some scars to show that I'd prioritize that.
I think that as entrepreneurs, even before you start to measure impact, you can actually establish governance practices on what you're not. As in, look, you're going to build a product, but you're not going to only make decisions that are driven by profit. Even before you start to integrate things, you can make decisions that, hey, even though a company is built for the sole purpose of making profit by definition for your shareholders, you can implement governance like our company put into practice more B corporation language in our governance documents, even before we serve, because we wanted to make sure that amongst each other, we agreed on certain tenets that we wouldn't cross the line of selling people's personal data. For instance, even though some people could build a company in our sector around a data play of selling personal information like Facebook did, we found that by saying, hey, this is a line that we're not going to cross, that was a way that we implemented things that would almost govern our decision making in perpetuity, even before we can start to think of the actual impact.
Yeah, I would just want to add that I think in the startup or world, there's kind of two broad categories. One is something that solves a problem, and one is things that people just want. And they're both valid, but they might kind of inform your path a little differently. That's one point. And the other point is one thing that now, after being in the social enterprise space for a while, I will say that no matter how compelling and how amazing your impact is, you still have to be an amazing solution, like the best solution. The impact cannot replace the relevance or the validity or how useful your solution is. And sometimes maybe people will buy or will engage a couple of times because they're informed consumers. But at the end of the day, you are really trying to build a great solution, a great company, but you're just guided by impact from, as a core operating, principle as well.
Thank you. Bye. So the second question from the audience that I picked here says the following: would love to learn any examples our panelists could share on how entrepreneurs creating products with a strong social benefit could best leverage the social impact to get the X factor on top of their business model beyond simple marketing messages. So any examples on how entrepreneurs can create products with a strong social benefit, how they can leverage the social impact beyond just marketing messages?
How they can leverage I'm sorry, could you rephrase it one more time?
How can they leverage their social impact angle in a way that is not just marketing?
I think that you can use it internally to inspire your team and to also attract talent that is of similar mindset than you. Because if you have a mission as an entrepreneur, and then you translate that into a business, and then you inspire your team and you get other people to adopt the same values, then this is what will equate to massive impact, because you're going to operate with a team of similar minds that has a mission that with social impact that other people are going to want to adopt and they're going to gravitate to. And that is, not marketing. That's like you're starting to live and breathe your mission.
And to add to that, when your people live and breathe your mission, you're also helping your bottom line, because you have less turnover within your company, which ultimately, helps your profits. So that's the X factor there, or hopefully getting closer to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. You mentioned in the beginning about how and I wasn't even aware of this data. I'd love to see it, that there is a business case to be an impact. And I love that, because while it's in my heart to be, have social impact, I also think that there is a strong business case for it, and that it will actually we're going to see the companies being redefined going forward. The innovators on this call, people care more than ever about social impact, and eventually it will actually look unfavorably as a company if you do not pay attention to your net impact on society.
And Neetal, since you work in the ecosystem space, ecosystem building for impact, I'm sure that you are aware of many of the narratives around impact. I wonder if you have any additional insights to share for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for both Melina and Justin for sharing. And that's an excellent question. That's why it took me a second, because I think that the poser of that question is picking up on something really critical. And I'll give a counter example. Tom's Shoes, which has been an early example of what a social enterprise can look like, because their business model is very clear: buy one, give one. That's been, set from day one, but it's also been marred by some very interesting, things, because they weren't necessarily addressing a root cause. So some of their efforts drove out local cobble, like shoemakers, from communities. ways and they didn't necessarily address the root problem. But more than that, as a brand, they're actually, I think, on track to maybe file for bankruptcy right now. So I think all of that is to say that, I think people are we're figuring out what those business models are. In a way, the buy one, give one aspect of it that I like is that it's a very clear business model for anyone within your entity, whether you're speaking to your investor or your accountant or a new employee, that model stays the same, the impact, but I think that may not be the best way to create a longevity of impact. So I guess there's not an easy answer. And I think that even though the social enterprise space has been around for a while, I think we're still finding where those edges are. So if whoever has that question, you are hopefully you feel empowered to be someone who resolves that question too, or takes that question out through your work and actually tries to, surmise what that best fit is. But I don't know. And because in impact, we also have different industries. Some are more, content based, some are more product based, and some are, working in emerging markets. Some are working in different markets. So I don't know that I know a very excellent answer to that, but I think it's a really critical question to be asking.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I want to thank you, obviously, the panelists, in case they have to leave. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the Stanford Lead and GSV participants, and obviously Hira, who has been helping behind the scenes as well. Thank you all